someone presents evidence of a claim, do you have a mental duty to study it before you attack it? If you want to help make an immediate change in your own and other people's lives, and for the better, today's show is one of the primary ways to do it. We're going to continue our study on the Trivium with Dr. Michael Labossiere, who is here to discuss logical fallacies.
All right, well, let's dive in. Why don't we start off with ad hominem?
All right. An ad hominem is a classic mistake. The basic idea, the literal translation from the Latin, means against the man or against the person. And the basic idea is, instead of attacking the person's claim, what is attacked is the person themselves. And there are a few varieties of this. For example, one common version is known as the personal attack, where what is done is, instead of attacking the person's claim, something about the person is attacked instead. And the reason why this is bad reasoning is because even though there's an attempt at a premise, that is to say, an attempt at evidence, the evidence actually is not relevant to the claim being made, which is called in logic the conclusion. So the person is trying to say that the person's claim is false, that's their conclusion, and they're doing it, though, on the basis of evidence, the premises, that don't actually connect.
What is a appeal to authority?
Appeal to authority actually, in a way, has two faces. There's a good face and the bad face. Now, back in the really old days, the time of people like Socrates, and back when I was a kid, a person could know, a lot of stuff. For example, someone like Aristotle wrote stuff about biology, about physics, and so on. And a person could be an expert in a huge range of fields. But today, of course, there's so much stuff, so much information, that none of us can claim to be experts on more than a very limited set of information. So we often have to rely on authorities in making arguments. Now, a good argument from authority, one that's not a fallacy, is when a person argues that a claim is correct because an authority has said so. For example, if someone is arguing about something in physics and they appeal to the authority of Stephen Hawking, that's probably a good argument because he's a well-established authority. Now, the fallacy occurs when the alleged authority is either not an authority because they lack the education, experience, and knowledge to be an authority, or in some way their credibility is in question. For example, they may be biased in some manner. So, if someone is making an argument about healthcare and they refer to, say, a doctor who's employed by the insurance companies or the pharmaceutical companies, then the person's credibility would be in question. It wouldn't prove that the person's claims are false, but the fact that they're biased, that they have a financial stake in it, would make their claims less credible. So in order to assess an argument from authority, you've got to determine, is the expert really an expert? Do they have the education? Do they have the experience? And very importantly, are they biased?
Appeal to belief.
Appeal to belief is a classic one, and it's very seductive in a way, because as human beings, we have a natural tendency to want to believe what people around us believe. We tend to go along with the group, for good or for bad. And the fallacy is this. It's when a person accepts that a claim is true, not based on actual evidence, but based on the claim that most or all people believe this claim. So, to use the classic example, if someone were to say, of course the Earth is flat, everyone believes it's flat, that's clearly a mistake. The mere fact that everyone believes something doesn't make it true.
Appeal to common practice.
Appeal to common practice is kind of the brother or sister of appeal to belief. In the case of appeal to belief, the idea is basically that a claim is true because people believe it, which is a mistake. In the case of appeal to common practice, the mistake being made is that someone accepts, reasons, or infers that a claim is correct or practice is correct simply because it's common. So if someone were to say, sure, it's okay to cheat on your taxes, everyone believes it, that'd be appeal to belief. If someone were to say, suppose I'm thinking about doing my taxes, and I'm like, well, I probably should pay all my taxes, but I'm pretty sure pretty much everyone cheats on the taxes, so it's okay for me to do it, that'd be an appeal to common practice. And the reason why this is a fallacy is because the mere fact that a lot of people do it, or most people do it, doesn't make it true, correct, or right, because the majority of people could be wrong.
Appeal to emotion.
Appeal to emotion can be seen as sort of a general sort of fallacy, with all the sorts of different feelings falling under it. Now, to sort of set the stage for it, emotions themselves aren't fallacies because they're not reasons or arguments. We just simply feel what we feel. And when we feel something, we just feel it. Now, the fallacy itself is this. It's when someone takes an emotion, for example, fear, anger, pity, and they accept that as evidence for a claim when it actually is not. And that's a mistake being made. Now, there are a variety of these, pretty much one for every emotion. For example, one fairly common one is what's known as appeal to fear or scare tactics, or in the Latin, ad baculum. And the idea is basically this. What a person does is to try to get someone to accept a claim. They don't give a logical reason for it. They try to create or invoke fear in the person. And their hope is that the person will accept the claim on that basis. For example, it can be something as crude as a direct threat. Believe this, or you'll be hurt or killed. It can also be a more subtle sort of threat. For example, take the various hair dyeing or products like deodorant and so forth, and they use a subtle sort of scare tactics. For example, one I saw recently, it shows like an older person going out on a date, and they have gray hair, and they go back to the woman's apartment, and he's like, "Hey, can I come in for coffee?" And she's like, "Oh no," and she closes the door and he goes home alone. But then it shows him doing his hair and dyeing it back to the young color, and of course she invites him in. So the idea is basically buy our product or you'll be alone forever. It's a subtle sort of scare tactic. It's also used a lot in politics. Oh, go ahead.
Well, marketing is basically instead of teaching people how to use logic, they're intentionally using the antithesis of logic to manipulate people for marketing.
Yes, and interestingly enough, or boringly enough, one thing I always tell my students is that if you want to persuade someone, if you want to sell a product, sell an idea, sell a politician, ironically, one of the best ways to do this is to use fallacies. For example, in politics, appeal to fear, scare tactics and so forth is a common thing. You make people afraid and get them to accept things. Similarly, like with the selling the hair dye, selling deodorant and dandruff shampoo, that's based on scaring people. And the reason why people do it is because it works. It works very well. So, sort of on the side of evil, if you want to persuade people, mastering fallacies is a very useful skill. If you want to defend against being emotionally manipulated, knowing about fallacies is very useful.
And so to level the playing field, basically everybody needs to know this stuff. So then it becomes more of a fun game instead of manipulation and lying and warfare and all of these political games and things that become a larger part of the problem. All right, appeal to flattery.
Appeal to flattery is essentially exactly what it sounds like. All of us, of course, we enjoy being praised. We enjoy people saying, how nice we look, or how smart we are, or how eloquent we are, or how nice our car is, or how good we look in a bathing suit. We like that kind of stuff. Now, if someone takes flattery and puts it in the place of evidence and gets people to accept a claim, that would be this fallacy, because someone is accepting flattery as evidence for a claim. For example, suppose there's a class on Plato, and one of the students, hasn't got his paper done, and he goes up to the professor and says, Professor Jones, I've been working hard on this paper, writing a defense of your view against the foolish people who attack you, but your view is so complex and so true and so compelling that I just can't do it justice in the time we have. So if I could only have another week to write the paper, I'm sure I could do you justice. And so the person is basically saying is, here I am kissing your butt, therefore I deserve another week on the paper. But it's essentially an appeal to flattery.
Appeal to novelty.
Appeal to novelty rests on a view that's fairly common in the West, namely that what is newer is better. Now, there are things, of course, that are newer that can be better. For example, the laptop I'm using now, except for its tendency to go into a blue screen of death, is better than my old Commodore 64. But it's not better because it's new. It's better because it has all these components and addition, more power, more memory, etc. But people often fall into the view that if something is old, it's outdated, and what's new, therefore, must be better. And this is often done like in business and academics. For example, having been on various committees, people will come in and say, well, we have this new method of assessment, and it's really, really good. And I'll be like, well, why is it good? And they'll say, well, it's new. And I'm like, well, that's not really a good reason. And the mere fact that it's like the latest, new or newest thing doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it bad, but it doesn't make it good. So the mere fact that something's new doesn't necessarily mean that it is, in fact, improved.
Appeal to popularity.
Appeal to popularity is kind of a variation on the appeal to belief. The idea is basically that something is correct or true or right simply because it's popular, simply because everyone accepts it or believes it. And just like with the appeal to belief, the mere fact that something is popular doesn't mean necessarily that it is true or correct. I mean, to use kind of a silly example, just because someone's the popular kid in school doesn't mean that they're the best kid or the correct or right. And the way to defend against this is the same way to defend against an appeal to belief. Basically ask yourself, okay, this is popular, most people seem to accept it, but does it make it true, correct, or right? So if people say, for example, if there's a poll that says Americans overwhelmingly want healthcare reform, does that mean it's a good idea? Well, it may be, it may not be. But the mere fact that it's popular with people doesn't make it necessarily true or false.
Appeal to ridicule. That's got to be a common one.
Oh, yes. The basic idea in this, it appeals to, the fact that people don't like being mocked and don't want to associate with people being mocked. For example, like back in junior high, the kid that everybody pointed at and laughed at, and generally you wouldn't want to be around that kid because the mockery against that person would kind of spill over to you. And the idea, this is also sometimes known as the horse laugh or appeal to mockery. The idea is to substitute mockery, laughter, or humor in the place of evidence. And while this can be entertaining and amusing, the fact that something is being mocked or made fun of doesn't prove that it's false, however entertaining it might be.
Appeal to spite.
Appeal to spite is a classic one. It's, for example, if you go back to the old Aesop's fable about the sour grapes, that'd be an example of appeal to spite in some ways. The basic idea is when a person, rejects a claim based on feelings of spite, based on that rejection. One way to look at it, again, is the case of the sour grapes, so the fox. The person can't get what they want, so they simply act in a spiteful manner and say, well, I guess it's not very, very good anyways. They reject something not out of reasons, but as the fallacy says, merely out of spite.
Appeal to tradition.
Interestingly enough, this is kind of the reverse of appeal to novelty. While on one hand, our society, especially people who are younger, they like the new, the novel. But there's also a strong tendency to reject and fear the new and the novel. So it's sort of this weird, dichotomy or thesis, antithesis in our society that we
insert Terrence McKenna here.
That we want the new, we fear the new, we want the old, we fear the old. And so the idea of the appeal to tradition is to believe, to accept as a reason for accepting a claim that, or practice or procedure, that it's been around a long time. So, for example, a person might say in the debate, one thing I commonly hear in the debate over same-sex marriage, people will say marriage has always been between a man and a woman, not between a man and a man. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Now, while that may be true, that there's a long tradition of marriage between a man and a woman, the mere fact that it's been done a long time, that it's a tradition, doesn't make it true. For example, murder is a very old tradition. So is genocide. So is racism. So is slavery. Slavery's been around a long time. But you won't hear people saying, well, slavery's been around a long time, so it's okay. Or, genocide's been around a long time, so it's okay. I mean, you do hear a few people say that.
Well, I heard somebody argue yesterday that, well, all things are based in slavery at some point, so therefore, using slavery as a reason not to do something is invalid.
Now, that's kind of a genetic fallacy right there, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, so the penal tradition is basically, again, that someone says, well, this is the way things have been done. It's the way it's old, way it's always been done. Therefore, it's correct. And again, the mere fact that it's been around a long time doesn't make it necessarily true or correct, because people can do stupid things for a really long time.
Bandwagon.
The bandwagon is kind of an old timer one. Back in the days before internet, even before radio, TV, the way politicians or people would advertise stuff is they would get a wagon, stick a band on it, put some banners and stuff, and they would go through the center of town, attracting people's attention. Now, this particular fallacy involves the following sort of bad reasoning. If a person accepts a claim or a candidate or a policy or procedure, not on the basis of its merit, not because it's correct or likely to be true, but simply because it's likely to win, then they're making this mistake. Now, again, this goes back to the distinction between a practical reason and a logical reason. From a practical standpoint, it's not very good being a loser. It's generally better to be on the winning side. But from a logical standpoint, the side that's winning, or the candidate that's winning, or the proposal that's winning, need not be correct. The mere fact that it's winning just means that it's winning. It doesn't mean it's
right. Yeah, they're not arguing for truth. They're arguing to be right or to win.
Yes. So from a practical standpoint, a person could say, "Well, I want to be on this side because it's winning," and they're not making any logical error. But if they say, "Well, this side is correct because it's winning," then they're making that mistake. Because to say that it's true because it's winning would be an error. Because as we've seen throughout history, ideas that are later shown to be mistaken were winning for a while. But now we know that they're not correct. So merely winning for a while doesn't make something true.
Begging the question.
Begging the question. This is also known as circular reasoning, and sometimes known by the very odd Latin name of petito principle. The idea in this, it's probably best exemplified by circular reasoning, is that what a person does is they assume as true what they in fact need to prove. And so the mistake they're making is if they have to prove it, they just can't assume that it's true. And the classic example of this is a favorite of parents everywhere. If they tell their kid, you can't do that, and the kid says, well, why are you right? And the parent says, I'm right because I say I'm right. That would be this fallacy. It's one that parents have used for quite some time. Now, a more sort of philosophical example of begging the question would be something a little more complex. Would be something like this. Suppose someone's discussing God, and they say to somebody, their friend, I've got proof that God exists. And the friend says, wow, that's pretty cool. Let me know. How does this work? And the person says, well, God exists because I have this book that shows that God exists. It's called the Bible. And suppose the person's friend says back, well, that's interesting, but there's all kinds of books about all kinds of things. For example, I have a book at home, The Lord of the Rings, which has talks about elves and dragons and so forth. But the mere fact that it's in a book doesn't make it true. So how do I know that this is actually correct? And the person says back, well, of course you can trust the book. It's written by God. And of course you can trust God. And that begs the question, because the question is, does God exist? And saying that there's a book written by God that proves God exists, and you can believe the book because God wrote it, begs the question. It assumes what is to be proven, namely whether God exists or not.
Biased sample.
Biased sample, or biased generalization, basic idea is this. When taking a sample and doing a poll, what a person has to do is basically make sure that the sample or poll is large enough and also representative. If a sample is not representative, it obviously won't capture the entire population. So if a person engages in a conclusion based on a sample that is biased, their result is not going to be very good. For example, suppose someone wants to know about what people think about gun ownership and in the United States. And they go and they send a survey or a poll to members of the NRA. And it comes back that 100% of them favor gun ownership. Now that sample, of course, is rather biased because obviously people who are in the NRA would tend to favor owning guns. Now people often use, if you ever wondered how groups like people who are pro-gun can find surveys that show that most Americans are pro-gun. People who are anti-gun can find surveys that show Americans are anti-gun. People who are pro-healthcare can find surveys that show Americans are pro-healthcare, and people who are against it can find surveys against it.
Burden of proof.
Oh, the burden of proof. Now, when arguing and debating, one thing you don't want on yourself is the burden of proof. If you have the burden of proof on you, you're the one that has to do the proving, and the other side can simply sit back and be assumed to be correct. Now, the fallacy occurs and the mistake occurs when the burden of proof is put on the wrong side. In other words, the person who is supposed to do the proving isn't doing it. Instead, the burden is put on the person who doesn't have to do this. Now, this raises the obvious question. Who gets the burden of proof? Now, there are three standards that are typically used. The first one is known as initial plausibility. The idea there is, how likely is it, before it's been investigated, that the claim is true? And the side that's got the initial plausibility doesn't get the burden of proof, because if their position is more plausible, we don't expect them to be the ones to have to prove it. For example, or to be the opposite, if the side has the lower initial plausibility, it gets the burden of proof. So if someone claims that they're abducted by aliens, for example, the burden of proof is on them because their claim has a very low initial plausibility. Of course, what counts as plausible or not is a matter of great contention because people believe what they believe has a great deal of plausibility. And so this can lead to serious debates about who's got the plausibility and who doesn't. The second thing is affirmative versus negative. Back when I did debate in high school and college, the idea was that the status quo could be assumed to be the default position. And if you're arguing against the status quo, it was up to you to prove that there had to be a change. And this can be seen as sort of like a conservative, leaning, but the idea is that the way things are assumed to be what is assumed, and arguments against those are the ones that have to do the proving, or so it's claimed. The third standard is basically special circumstances. For example, in the American legal system, there's an assumption of innocence, so the burden of proof is on the prosecution. So, for example, if I get arrested for something, philosophizing without a license, and it'd be up to the prosecutor to show that I was, guilty of this. And if they can't make their case, I'd be assumed to be innocent. And of course, this varies from country to country. In other places, there's an assumption of guilt. And so burden of proof is a matter of great contention, which is not surprising. Because if you get the burden of proof stuck on you, it's like being forced to run uphill or fight uphill. You've got to do much more work.
Circumstantial ad hominem.
This one is, speaking of ad hominems, this is a form of ad hominem, so it's an attack on the person. But what makes it circumstantial is the attack is not directly on a person's characteristics, like being a jerk or whatever. It's on their circumstances. For example, the way I usually divide personal attack from circumstantial is that with a personal attack, it's something sort of intrinsic to the person, like being a jerk or being like a man or a woman. Whereas the circumstances, one way to characterize it, it's something the person belongs to voluntarily. For example, being in a political party or church or being say, a college freshman, for example, and the person's attacked on those grounds. So if someone says, the freshman's got his facts wrong, with the implication being that, I'm mistaken because I was a freshman, that'd be like a circumstantial ad hominem. It's often done in cases where the person's circumstances would seem to bias the person. For example, if someone says, yeah, Jane gives a really good argument about why the small business tax should be reduced, and she says, it'll benefit the economy, blah, blah, blah. But we all know that Jane owns that little bookstore down on Main Street, so her argument is clearly wrong. And that'd be a circumstantial ad hominem, because the mere fact that she's a small business owner and stands to benefit from, reduced tax doesn't mean she's mistaken. Doesn't mean she's right, but doesn't mean she's mistaken.
Composition.
I thought it's used to call this the grandmother fallacy. To assume what is true of the parts must be true of the whole. To use a slightly more serious example, suppose you take some really great basketball players, and someone says, well, we have all these all-stars on our basketball team, on our Olympic team, therefore they'll be a great team. Well, as we found out when we didn't win the gold that one year, you could have great players, but they may not be the best team. Because what's true of the individuals may not be true of the whole thing. And so that can be a fairly common mistake.
Confusing cause and effect.
This one, as the name pretty much says it all. The idea is basically a person takes the cause as the effect, or the effect as the cause. Now, in some cases, people make this mistake, and the mistake, which arises from a lack of caution in causal reasoning, sometimes can be fairly obvious. For example, a person might reason like this. They might look and say, well, people who own homes tend to commit fewer crimes. They tend to be, say, more responsible citizens. They tend to be, pay more taxes. They tend to be employed. And a person might say, well, look at this. These homeowners are, good citizens for the most part. Therefore, if we give people, houses, they'll become more responsible. It will lower crime, etc. Now, the problem, of course, is that this is reversing cause and effect. People are able to afford, houses because, in general, they tend to be responsible. They tend to have money and so forth. So it's a reversal. It's not that houses make people more responsible. It's that, in general, when people are responsible to a degree, they're able to get the money and the loans and so forth to get a house.
Division.
Division is kind of the cousin of sort of the twin of composition. Division occurs in the exact opposite way. It's when someone assumes uncritically what is true of the whole thing must be true of the parts. For example, going with the team analogy, for example, if there's a team that's pretty good, and someone says, wow, that team's really good, so all the individuals must be great, that would be a mistake, because although the team overall is really good, the individuals may not be great. They just may work together pretty well. Or another example would be something like, to use kind of a silly example, cats have color. You can see cats. Cats are made of atoms, therefore atoms have color, which is, of course, not true.
False dilemma.
False dilemma. Now, a dilemma, as the name states, is basically when you have two options, say A or B. Now, a real dilemma occurs when you really do only have two choices. There's only, option A or option B. Now, a false dilemma occurs when someone presents two alternatives, A and B, as if they're the only two, and when in fact they're not the only two. So someone presents option A, option B, and they try to, convince you that option B isn't good, therefore you should accept A. And the dilemma is false when there are actually more alternatives than just A and B. And there are several variations on this. One common one is the perfectionist fallacy, where someone would say that either something has to be perfect or you have to reject it. For example, someone might say, this healthcare reform bill is full of all these problems. It will never solve all our healthcare reforms or issues, therefore we must reject it. And that'd be a false dilemma, because we don't require, something that solves all our problems or nothing. there are other alternatives. We could have something that works, good enough.
Gambler's fallacy.
Gambler's fallacy. In addition to prostitution, is what makes Las Vegas stay in business. Basic idea is this: it occurs when someone believes incorrectly that the past events in a series that involve this predictable ratio affect the next event in the series when in fact there's no connection. The example I always use in my class is playing roulette. Suppose someone's playing roulette. The odds of winning in roulette, picking one number, are 1 in 38. And so if a person's lost 10 times and they say, okay, I've lost 10 times, I'm due to win, they're committing the gambler's fallacy because they're mistakenly believing that the past outcomes affect the current outcome, which it doesn't, because their chance of winning on the 11th spin is still 1 in 38, and their chance of winning on the 12th spin is still 1 in 38. So the gist of the gambler's fallacy is when someone thinks that things are going to change or be different when in fact they're not.
Genetic fallacy.
The genetic fallacy. This derives its name from Genesis. It's the mistake, that the origin of a claim somehow discredits the claim itself, that some perceived defect in this origin somehow discredits it. So, for example, if I say, Ted claims that the Reform Bill is a bad idea, but Ted's a Republican, so he's wrong, that'd be an ad hominem. If I were to say, the Republicans claim that the Reform Bill is a bad idea, they're Republicans, so they're wrong, that'd be a genetic fallacy. It's where the origin of the claim is taken as discrediting the claim, when in fact it does not.
Guilt by association.
Guilt by association. The basic idea here is that it cashes in on the fact that when something, an idea, a person, a claim, is associated with something negative, that we generally tend to want to reject that claim or idea based not on any flaws in the claim or idea, but based on that association. For example, one thing I've often seen in debates over, atheism versus, belief, is people sometimes point out that Hitler supposedly was a Christian, and they'll say, therefore, Christianity is mistaken or flawed or awful. But, of course, the mere fact that, Hitler supposedly was a Christian, that doesn't prove or disprove anything about Christianity itself. It's merely a guilt by association. Although we're judged by the company we keep, our company doesn't prove or disprove the claims we make.
Hasty generalization.
Hasty generalization. A classic problem. The basic idea is that someone takes a sample that's inadequate and leaps to a conclusion about this. Stereotypes, for example, are often grounded on this sort of bad reasoning. And here's an example of one from my own experience. I was riding along in my 10-speed, cruising around, and a blue station wagon, comes up behind me, and they're honking and yelling at me. And I'm trying to get out of the way, and they ended up bumping into me and throwing me onto the lawn. And I looked at the plates in the car, and I saw I was from Ohio. And I was going off to Ohio, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to go to a state full of psychotic, crazy drivers. And so, I go to Ohio, and then I'm, running with a cross-country coach, and we're running along, on the sidewalk, and I hear honking behind me, and another car, a blue car, but not the same blue car, pulls up onto the sidewalk and almost kills both of us. We had to leap over this stone wall to get out of the way. And I thought on the basis, of these two drivers, that drivers in Ohio were crazy and psychotic. Now, it turned out I was correct. This later turned out to be true, but it was a hasty generalization because I only had two examples. You can't leap from two samples to the whole population.
Ignoring a common cause.
This one is a mistake in causal reasoning. What occurs is this. You have two things occurring, A and B, and what a person does is, instead of considering the possibility there's a third factor, say C, causing both, they simply leap to the conclusion that A causes B. For example, suppose somebody's got a fever and they've got a sore throat, and they say, my fever is causing my sore throat. In that case, they're making a mistake, possibly, because they should consider that there may be a third factor, namely, say, a virus, that's causing both the fever and the sore throat. Suppose someone's having a problem with their microphone and their computer is crashing. And they say, well, the microphone is causing my computer to crash. Well, it may be an underlying factor, say Windows, or a virus or something that's actually causing both problems. So it's always important to consider that possibility.
Middle ground.
Middle ground occurs. It's based on the natural assumption that somehow compromises or the middle position is correct. For whatever reason, in a way kind of going back to the false dilemma, we seem to have a tendency to believe there's two options, one side or the other. We often talk about both sides of the issue. And from this, it's almost natural to believe that if there are two sides, the correct thing must lie somewhere in the middle. But of course, the mere fact that something's in the middle between two positions doesn't necessarily make it correct. Take the case of like politics. If someone proposes, one plan for healthcare reform, and someone proposes another one, like say doing nothing, doesn't mean the middle ground is correct. The middle ground can be quite mistaken.
Misleading vividness.
Misleading vividness. Now, psychologically, people tend to remember things that are vivid, that really stand out. And the way this works psychologically is that people will tend to weigh vivid, dramatic incidences, evidence, etc., far more than they will weigh less vivid statistical evidence. So what people do, basically, if you're using a scale, you could have on one side all sorts of statistical evidence, but kind of boring, just statistics. Then if you have a really vivid incident, people tend to give that far more weight because it's far more vivid. So one thing we have to do, the way to defend against this, is to, when you're thinking about things, like what we're doing, in terms of what we do in life or what sort of things we buy, we have to ask, am I making this decision based on, good reasons and good evidence, or am I being sort of overwhelmed by a particular vivid example? And this often also leads to stereotypes. For example, I've had friends who've, dated someone who turned out to be, terrifyingly psychotic. And they're like, wow, everybody, I'm never going to date again because it's always going to be a nightmare and horrible. And of course, what they're remembering is that one horrible incident and not thinking about it statistically. That it's less likely that it's going to be terrible and psychotic, maybe.
Poisoning the well.
Poisoning the well. It's a form of ad hominem, and it gets its name from a practice developed and perfected by the Romans. The idea is basically this. Suppose you're, a Roman, leader, and you've got, a village near your border that's causing some trouble. You can march a legion down there and put them to the sword, but that'd be a lot of work. A quicker way to do it, a cheaper way, is to get a dead goat, put a rock on it, throw it in the well. Because when people drink out of that well, they become sick and poisoned, and it kills them. Now, the fallacy doesn't involve putting a dead goat in your opponent's well, although I guess that can be kind of effective. The fallacy is to try to discredit in advance what a person is going to say by attacking them before they make their claims. So it's sort of a preemptive ad hominem. The idea is the person hasn't made their claim yet. What you do is you attack the person in the hopes that they will be poisoned as a source. So people will, reject what they say.
Post hoc. And if you would give the full Latin name of that, I would appreciate it.
Sure. Its full Latin is post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. Now, outside of science fiction, for the most part, a cause does have to occur before its effect. But the mistake being made here is when a person uncritically assumes that because A occurred before B, that A must have caused B. Think about, for example, some folk remedies. Someone may say, drinking tea will cure your cold. And they'll say, oh, I drank some tea and my cold was gone. Therefore, it caused that to happen. And that'd be post hoc, because people tend to think, I did something and then an effect occurred. And of course, they tend to remember where the effect happened and forget the other times when it didn't happen. And so it's a common occurrence. And the way to be on guard against it is to ask yourself, okay, this happened and this happened, but was there any real connection? And the way
then you have to find out if it's repeatable.
Yeah, exactly right, because that's the hallmark of the scientific method is that you can keep testing that, keep repeating it. So if tea really does cure colds, then in general, when people drink tea, there should be a correlation between tea drinking and colds going away. And
never mind the specifics about the type of tea.
Well, you want to include that too. Is it Earl Grey?
Right.
Because I know Captain Picard never had a cold, so maybe it is the magic of Earl Grey that heals people.
Questionable cause.
Questionable cause. This is kind of a general category. Any of the mistakes in causal reasoning, like post hoc, also things like reversing cause and effect, can be put under here, as well as ignoring the possibility of causation, of coincidence. In some cases, one thing happens, another thing happens, and there's really no causal connection. And so when people, when things are happening, people should always ask, is there really a connection? Am I reversing cause and effect? Am I ignoring a common cause? Am I assuming, a common cause? Am I merely making a mistake with coincidence? For example, when ice cream sales go up, more people die from drowning. Does this mean that ice cream kills? It's true. It's true. Ice cream sales go up, more deaths by drowning. Does that mean that ice cream kills people? No. What happens is, of course, ice cream sales go up in the summer when it's warmer, and of course people swim more in the summer, and hence they're in the water more, so people tend to drown a bit more. So ice cream is safe, and you can still eat the ice cream.
Let's go with red herring, but let's also discuss the history and origin of that.
Red herring gets its name from kind of an interesting scenario. When people train hunting dogs, let's take for example beagles, what they typically do is train them to look for a particular type of animal, say a rabbit or a raccoon or birds or something. And of course, you want your dog to be able to find what you're looking for. Let's say a rabbit. And the way they train them, at least the story goes, is they would create a trail, and they would take a red herring, which is a very stinky sort of rotting fish, and they would rub it across the trail. And if the dog could follow the trail even through the stinky rotted fish, then that would be a good hunting dog. Now, in the case of the fallacy, it's not that you take a stinky fish and hit your opponent with it, although that would serve to distract them. The idea is this. When a person is talking about an issue, and they'd rather not continue talking about that issue, they want to change it to some other subject, what they'll do is they'll throw in another issue, like a red herring, to lead the person off that subject. It's often done typically by politicians. For example, when they're being interviewed on the news and they're asked about something they'd rather not answer, they'll switch to some other issue to try to get the conversation onto something else. For example, and if they're smart, what they'll do is they'll try to get the issue to something similar so people don't notice the switch. For example, suppose somebody is asked during an interview, has the Patriot Act made America more safe since, 2001? And a person might say, I can say with certainty that America is still the safest country in the world. Now, it seems related, but they're not the same issue. The first issue is, did the Patriot Act make us safer? And the other issue is America still safe? And they're really not the same issue. Now, you can also use this on a personal level. For example, suppose, I've stayed home all day playing Warcraft, and I was supposed to do several projects around the house and home, and here my girlfriend pull in, and I realize, crap, I've been running instances all day, and I haven't done a damn thing, and so I think I'm going to catch hell. But when she comes in, I realize that she was supposed to go shopping, but she didn't buy any groceries, and she says, hey, you didn't do any of the projects, and I say, well, I noticed you don't have any groceries. I'm using a red herring, because the issue is my laziness and my playing Warcraft instead of doing the stuff I was supposed to do, and the fact that she didn't get the groceries has no actual relevance.
Relativist fallacy.
The relativist fallacy occurs when relativism is the view that truth or moral correctness is relative to the culture, and a variation of this subjectivism is a view that truth or moral worth or beauty, some sort of value, is relative to the individual. Now, the mistake being made here assumes something contentious, namely that relativism or subjectivism is incorrect. So if someone were to say, for example, suppose someone's taking a test and they're cheating on it, another student says, hey, cheating is wrong, and the person says to the student, well, cheating may be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me, and they believe that it's not wrong for them because they think it's relative, that would be this mistake. Now, this is kind of a contentious fallacy because there are, philosophers who do argue for relativism. And if relativism is correct, then this would not be a fallacy. Because if something is true for me and not true for you, there's no mistake. And, for example, the sophists had that view that, truth is relative and there's no objective truth, and so there would be no mistake being made there. And so this is a somewhat contentious fallacy.
Let's go with another good one, slippery slope.
The slippery slope. There's actually two versions of this. One is the classic slippery slope. The other one is known as the Vietnam fallacy. I'll do the slippery slope first. It's sometimes also known as the camel's nose because, at least according to, people who know about camels, once a camel gets its nose in your tent, it's hard to keep the rest of the camel out of the tent. Now, as a fallacy, it gets its sort of idea, the metaphor here, or the image, based on if you're on top of like a really slippery slope, like an icy hill, and you take a first step and you fall, zoop, you're down at the bottom. Now, the fallacy is this. It's when someone claims that one thing must inevitably fall from another thing without actually giving an argument for the inevitability. Typically, this is done when the thing that's supposed to be inevitable is supposed to be really bad. For example, I've been involved in lots of debates about same-sex marriage. One thing that people almost inevitably bring up is that if we allow same-sex marriage, the next thing you know, people will be marrying goats and turtles and God knows what else. But of course, there's a long way between allowing, same-sex marriage and having people marrying goats. I don't see that as likely to happen. Or as another example, a person might say, we can't allow any censorship at all, because if we censor anything, the next thing you know, they'll be burning books in the street. And of course, that's a slippery slope.
Allowing medical marijuana, the next thing we'll have heroin shooters on every corner.
Well, that's actually true. So that's not. that would be the fallacy.
Special pleading.
Special pleading is basically when a person, they want to be like exempted from something, or they want to get special treatment, but they don't have any actual justification for it. Essentially, what they're doing, to put it kind of in its simplest and crudest form, they're basically saying that I deserve an exception because I'm me. And of course, it's not a good argument because everybody is who they are, and everybody can make that argument. For example, recently, the building where my department is going through renovation, and they promised that we'll have like a really, really nice place. And they moved us to a not so nice place now. But suppose during the packing I were to say, well, since I am an esteemed, academic, I cannot, soil my hands with this packing, so therefore, I should not have to do this. That could be seen as sort of special pleading because everyone else is in academics too, and there's nothing special about me. I should not deserve an exemption from that.
Spotlight.
The spotlight. This works pretty much just like what it's named after, its namesake. When a spotlight is shining on someone on stage, they're illuminated, everything else is in darkness, and so all your attention is on, that person. Now, the spotlight fallacy is usually fueled by the folks in the media. The idea behind this fallacy is it's when someone takes that's something that is given a lot of attention, as I say, in the spotlight, as somehow serving as evidence that is something very common, or essentially it's kind of like hasty generalization, where someone says uses a small amount of evidence to take that as a support a general claim. Now, in the case of the spotlight, what a person does is they reason, or badly reason, like this: there's a lot of attention, particularly in the media, being paid to this. Therefore, this is something important or something that's likely to happen. For example, given the coverage in the media of, say, the underwear bomber or terrorism, we would think that terrorism was really likely. Like I mentioned before, when I was flying, I was going to fly home after the underwear bomber thing, and the people asked me, are you afraid of flying? And I said, no, not at all, because statistically, I'm more likely to be killed on my morning run, going to the airport, or slipping and falling in the bathroom of the airport than I am to be killed by a terrorist. It's just that the media really focuses on terror. And so the idea is, kind of like misleading vividness, or haste generalization, we look at what people are paying attention to and see it as somehow more likely or more important when it need not be.
Straw man.
The straw man. This is a classic one. The idea basically is this. Suppose I want to argue, attack, or criticize a person's position. Now, one way I could do this is to actually attack or criticize or argue against the person's position. But that can be kind of hard, because then I have to know what their position is and have to actually argue against it.
You have to do some research and reading and study at that point, basically, right? Or get a lot of clarification, at least.
Yes, and that's hard, and I'm kind of lazy. So I just want to attack them without any real effort. So the way I can do a straw man is, instead of attacking their actual view, their actual position, what I do is put in its place a distorted, exaggerated view that's not really their view or their position, and attack that instead. Now, the reason why people do this is because it works. One reason is that, as you pointed out, knowing the actual position or view, especially when it's something complex, like, for example, something like healthcare reform or a philosophical or political view, those can be very complicated, and most people don't know what those things are. So when someone straw mans a person's view, the audience often doesn't know. And of course, secondly, it's exaggerating things, distorting things, so hyperbole can often be very effective because people often expect that. For example, if we take the healthcare issues, when they brought up the notion of death panels. Now, if you look at the actual language, there's nothing in there about death panels, not surprisingly. But of course, most people haven't read, the proposals because it's really long and really boring. And of course, death panels are scary. So people were strawmanning the proposals in that manner in order to create fear and also to get people to, reject those proposals. And so a straw man involves presenting that distorted or exaggerated view. And it's commonly done in politics, very common.
Two wrongs make a right.
This one is based on people's notion that if someone would be willing to do something wrong to them, they can do that wrong to the other person, even if they don't need to do that in self-defense. To be a little clearer, the idea is this. Suppose, a person reasons like this. It's okay for me to do something to another person because they would do that to me. And of course, that's a mistake in reasoning. Why so? Well, let's take a concrete example. Suppose on Tuesday, when I, teach, a lot of classes, I've taught, 3 classes and I'm getting ready for my night class, and I find I'm pretty hungry. And I go and, look to see if I brought my dinner, and I realize that I've left it at home. So I am without dinner. And so I think, wait, I can go over to, Professor Counsel's office, and she's got that little fridge there. I'll open her fridge up. Oh, what's in there? Ooh, a little, leftover beef stew. And so I grab it. But then, of course, being a philosopher, I pause to think, is this okay for me to do? And so I tell myself, well, I'm taking her stew, but she would do the same thing to me. So it's okay. And then I go and cook the stew and eat it. Now, obviously, if it's wrong for her to take my food, it's wrong for me to take her food, and I can't justify what I'm doing by saying that it's wrong for her to do it to me, so it's okay for me to do it to her. That's clearly bad reasoning. Now, there are 2 sort of like exceptions or complications. One is self-defense. If you do something to someone to defend yourself legitimately, that wouldn't be too wrong. So, like, suppose, someone tries to mug you, and you hit them in the face with a brick, and you say, it was okay for me to hit them with a brick because they were trying to kill me, that wouldn't be 2 wrongs. And of course, there's also the question about, retribution and punishment. If someone does something wrong, do we have the right to harm them? And some people think, yeah, they believe in retributivism, that we can harm people who've done wrong. Other people, of course, believe that we shouldn't do that kind of stuff. But the basic idea behind two wrongs is that a person believes it's wrong to do, but somehow, if they're doing it to someone else, it's somehow okay. But if it's wrong, well, it's wrong.
All right, let's see here. What other fallacies didn't we cover?
Well, there's lots of fallacies out there. In fact, there's potentially thousands of them. For example, one sort of variation of the red herring is sort of its cousin, the smoke screen. And the idea is sort of a rhetorical tactic where instead of like throwing out another issue in the hopes of luring someone off on that issue, what a person does is essentially piles up issue after issue in the hopes that the person will be kind of lost in the confusion. And that can be kind of effective. It's basically, the reason they call it smokescreen is like in the military application, if troops are under fire, they throw out smoke grenades because it's harder to hit something when you can't see it. And it's kind of the rhetorical equivalent of that. There's also, from some other fallacies, there's various other emotional ones as well, like appeals. For example, there's appeal to jealousy, appeal to guilt, which basically use those emotions. And there's also other causal fallacies about causal reasoning. For example, when people believe that correlation is the same thing as causation, that's a fallacy. And of course, there's also the generic one of the non sequitur, does not follow. And the basic idea there is that a person, draws a conclusion that simply doesn't fall from the evidence. And there's also lots of them that are simply not named, because they're not common enough. But the general idea, of course, is that a fallacy is when the premises, the evidence being offered, doesn't logically support that conclusion. And in theory, there's potentially an infinite number of these things, because there's always an infinite way to be wrong, and usually only a few ways to be right.